Perfection was their gospel, their competition, their obsession. And I, an inconvenient accident, was the stain on their otherwise spotless existence. Both my parents were prodigies, locked in a relentless race to outshine one another since their high school days. When they landed at the same prestigious university, rivalry gave way to romance. Two brilliant minds, perfectly matched in intellect, yet utterly unprepared for parenthood. My existence was an anomaly they hadn't planned for, a deviation from their meticulously designed future. They admitted as much, more than once. Had it not been for the rhythmic flicker of my heartbeat on the ultrasound screen, or the looming wrath of their devout parents, I wouldn't have made it past a mere possibility. But fate had other plans. 9 months later, I arrived. And so began their first great debate: which one of them would sacrifice their ambitions to raise me? In the end, logic prevailed. My mother, the higher earner, returned to work while my father stayed behind to mold me into something worthy. From the moment I could grasp a toy, my world was a laboratory, my life an experiment. My parents weren't interested in raising a child, they wanted to manufacture a genius. Play was a calculated endeavor, each activity designed to sharpen cognitive skills. Blocks and logic puzzles were acceptable, paintbrushes were forbidden. Creativity was chaos, and chaos had no place in their vision for me. Television? A waste of time. Sweets? Absolutely not. At birthday parties, I sat at the edge of the table, watching as other kids devoured slices of cake, my stomach empty, my mouth watering. My parents had already warned the hosts: no sugar, no junk, no exceptions. But for all their efforts to control me, the one place they held no power was my grandparents' house. Those weekends were my escape, my only taste of freedom. My grandfather introduced me to the beauty of old black and white films, stories that transported me to worlds where I wasn't just a failed experiment but a person, free to dream. Yet the tighter you grip something, the more determined it becomes to break free. By my teenage years, rebellion brewed beneath my carefully controlled surface. I learned to navigate their rules, to bend without breaking. What they didn't know wouldn't hurt them. I snuck out to parties, smuggled makeup in my backpack, and enrolled in pottery classes, a direct defiance of their rigid expectations. Sometimes I was caught, and when I was, the punishments were swift and merciless. Lectures about wasted potential, threats of a bleak future if I didn't conform. Then came the moment that shattered any illusion that I could ever be enough for them. A boy asked me out. A cute boy. A boy who saw me, not my GPA, not my potential, just me. We went on a date, and for once, I felt normal. But as fate would have it, my parents caught us, just as he leaned in for a kiss. They were furious. That night, they made it clear that I wasn't just disappointing them, I was shaming them. My mother, sharp as a blade, reminded me that she hadn't sacrificed her career for me to throw my future away on some boy. My father, no less cruel, scoffed at my attempts to justify myself. And then came the final blow. "We already regret having you," they said. The words hollowed me out, left me standing there, silent and shattered. But it wasn't until later that night, eavesdropping on their conversation from the shadows of the hallway, that I learned the truth. A son! They had wanted a son. A son would have been an achievement, something they could take pride in. But me? I was just their greatest disappointment. From that moment on, I stopped fighting. I followed every rule, met every expectation. Not because I believed they would love me for it, but because I no longer knew what else to do. They didn't cheer for me at graduation. They forbade me from attending the celebration, claiming it was pointless. College was no different. I had secured a full scholarship, earning their reluctant approval, but my father was determined to shape my path. He arranged internships before my first semester even began, eager to thrust me into the professional world before my peers had even settled into their dorms. At the time, I believed they knew best. I let them steer my life, let them strip me of choices until I was nothing but an empty vessel for their ambitions. And then college happened. Biology was my prison. I had never chosen it, had never even considered what I wanted. But no matter how many hours I spent buried in textbooks, I hated every second of it. My grades slipped. Depression sank its claws into me, and for the first time, I had no strength left to fight back. Then came Gerald. Gerald was everything my parents were not. He was warmth, laughter, a hand reaching out to pull me into the light. His family was the kind I had only seen in movies, supportive, affectionate, human. The more time I spent with him, the more I began to see my life for what it was. My parents hadn't raised me. They had programmed me. And when I finally opened up to Gerald about it, he was the first person to name it for what it was: abuse. I had spent my entire life trying to prove myself to people who would never love me. And for what? When my grades began to slip, my parents descended upon me like vultures. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't notice the exhaustion in my voice or the weight in my chest. They were too busy being embarrassed. I'll never forget that moment, the absolute absurdity of it. They weren't ashamed because I was suffering. They were ashamed because people might find out. That was the breaking point. For the first time in my life, I said no. I told them I hated biology. I told them I wanted to switch to psychology, a field that actually interested me. They lost it. To them, psychology wasn't a degree, it was a failure. But I had finally reached my limit. I was an adult now. And for the first time, I was choosing myself. The fight was brutal. They threatened me, swore they'd make my life a living hell. And when I still didn't bend, they pulled their final card, disownment. But they hadn't counted on one thing. I wasn't alone anymore. My grandparents stood by me. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Because I knew now, being free, truly free, was worth any price. Convincing my parents to stop pressuring me into a future I didn't want was a battle I barely won. They didn't relent easily. Their threats loomed over me like storm clouds, dark and unyielding. If I dared to cut ties with my grandparents, they swore they'd sever ties with me as well. The standoff stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but in the end, I prevailed. I changed my degree. Liberation tasted sweeter than I had imagined. For the first time, college felt like more than an obligation, it was mine to enjoy. Mornings no longer carried the weight of anxiety, and meals didn't taste like impending doom. I buried myself in books, spent my days between lectures and library desks, and when evening fell, I explored the city with Gerald by my side. 2 years into our relationship, I knew it was time, my parents had to meet him. His family already welcomed me, so it only felt right. I expected resistance, but their reaction was colder than I had prepared for. Dinner was a stiff, silent affair. They barely acknowledged Gerald, their disapproval thick enough to choke on. The moment he left, the floodgates burst open. They called him unworthy, a man from a lowly background with an arts degree they despised. And, of course, they accused him of ulterior motives. Surely, he was only with me for my family's wealth. Their words were ridiculous, infuriating. Gerald never once pried about my family's finances, he only knew what little I had shared. His love was real. Mine was, too. It pained me that they refused to see it. But my grandparents? Their reaction was the complete opposite. The moment they met Gerald, they beamed with approval. They praised his manners, his kindness, the way he carried himself. Their support strengthened my resolve. Despite my parents' protests, I married Gerald after graduation. It was the best decision of my life. For the first time, I had a home that felt warm, welcoming, something I never had growing up. We moved across the country, miles away from my parents' cold presence, and built something beautiful together. Then, a year later, I found out I was pregnant. The news should have been pure joy, but my past clung to me like a ghost. My parents never wanted me, their resentment had been a shadow over my childhood. What if history repeated itself? What if Gerald reacted the same way? But when I told him, his face lit up with an emotion so pure, so overwhelming, that my fear crumbled. He wrapped me in his arms, his voice thick with excitement as he whispered about our future. In that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. His joy forced me to look inward. My child would never endure what I had. I refused to let them grow up in a house filled with suffocating expectations and cold indifference. One day, during a routine checkup, the doctor's words changed everything. Twins. I stared at the ultrasound screen, heart hammering. 2 heartbeats. 2 lives. My gaze darted to Gerald, who looked just as shocked, his eyes wide with wonder. It was overwhelming and thrilling all at once. Our small family was about to double in size. Plans shifted. 2 cribs, double the clothes, twice the diapers, we had to adjust. We threw ourselves into preparation, attending prenatal classes, reading every parenting book we could get our hands on, and turning one of our rooms into a cozy nursery. Through it all, Gerald's unwavering support made every challenge feel surmountable. Then, something unexpected happened. My parents reached out. They spoke of excitement, of anticipation. But their sudden shift in behavior set my nerves on edge. Had they truly changed, or was there something more beneath the surface? When the time came for the gender reveal, Gerald's parents hosted a small gathering. Friends, family, everyone we loved was there. Even my parents, who had flown in, staying in a nearby hotel. The moment arrived. Gerald's mother handed us 2 sealed envelopes, the secret of our baby's identities hidden inside. With bated breath, we opened them. A pink card. A blue card. A daughter. A son. Laughter, cheers, warm embraces, joy exploded around us. Gerald's parents beamed with pride, my grandparents were over the moon, and our friends showered us with love. But as I scanned the room, something gnawed at me. My parents weren't celebrating. They stood apart, their faces unreadable. No hugs, no words of joy. Just silence. A heavy, damning silence. The unease festered long after the party ended. I needed answers. Sitting them down, I asked directly, "Why were you so distant today?" Their answer hit like a slap. Disappointment. They were disappointed. They had hoped for 2 sons. I recoiled, stunned. Their mindset was archaic, absurd. And then, like a puzzle falling into place, I remembered how they had always longed for a son, how my existence had been an inconvenience. They hadn't changed. Not really. Something in me snapped. Maybe it was the pregnancy hormones. Maybe it was years of pent-up anger. But I saw red. My voice rose, shaking with fury. "Get out!" My mother bristled, throwing back some nonsense about how I should behave more ladylike. I didn't care. Not anymore. I all but shoved them out of my house, slamming the door in their stunned faces. Gerald was by my side in an instant, concern etched into his expression. I turned to him, voice trembling but firm. They hated me for being a daughter. They won't get to know mine. They tried. Weeks passed, then months, filled with half-hearted apologies, manipulative guilt trips. They claimed they had a right to be in their grandchildren's lives. I refused. Gerald stood by me without question. Our children wouldn't be tainted by their outdated, poisonous beliefs. Then, last week, I gave birth. The moment I held my babies in my arms, something inside me shifted. It was love, fierce, overwhelming, consuming. I had never been happier. Gerald was there every step of the way, holding my hand, whispering words of encouragement. His mother stayed with us, helping with the babies since Gerald's work leave was short. And then, yesterday morning, a package arrived. Expensive gifts. Extravagant beyond reason. A note, tucked neatly inside. "Flying to see you soon, my boy. Your grandparents." My stomach turned. My gaze flickered to the gifts, bile rising in my throat. Every single one was for my son. Not my daughter. Not me. Just him. Even now, after everything, they still thought they had a place in his life. I took a breath, steadying myself. Then, I sent them a message, calm, clear, final. They were not welcome. Not now. Not ever. If they showed up, I'd call the police. The fallout was immediate. Calls, messages, accusations of ungratefulness. I ignored them all. According to them, I was being controlling. I called it breaking the cycle. I couldn't, in good conscience, allow my parents anywhere near my son when they so blatantly disregarded my daughter. Grandparents or not, their title didn't entitle them to poison my family with their favoritism. I refused to let my little girl grow up feeling lesser, unnoticed, just as I had. Cutting them off was the only option. Update 1. I never expected my story to gain so much attention so quickly. But in just a few hours, the response flooded in. Reading through the comments, I felt an overwhelming sense of validation. So many of you understood what I had endured, and more importantly, you agreed, what my parents did was inexcusable. And I stand by that. I refuse to let my daughter grow up in a home where she is treated as second best. I know what it's like to be the afterthought, the unwanted child. The scars of my parents' toxic upbringing still linger, and I won't let history repeat itself. The idea of them imposing their warped beliefs on my children makes my stomach churn. It baffles me, how can two highly educated people still cling to such outdated, ridiculous ideals? Their intelligence didn't stop them from making my childhood miserable, and I see no reason to trust them now. If they stay in our lives, they'll bring the same cruelty, the same wounds, to my daughter. That is something I will never allow. Thankfully, I am not alone. Gerald, his parents, and my grandparents have stood by me through all of this. My grandparents, in particular, are furious. They've confronted my parents, made it clear where their loyalties lie. But whether their words had any impact? I don't know. Gerald and I reached a decision. The gifts my parents sent? We would send them right back. A message they could not ignore. Tomorrow, they would be gone. Update 2. I did it. I shipped the gifts back, cutting off their attempt to buy their way into my son's life. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The calls started immediately. Text after text. Insistent. Demanding. They wanted to meet. I agreed, but on my terms. That weekend, I asked them to fly out for a final conversation, face to face. No more games. No more excuses. I chose a public place, a small restaurant near our home. A neutral ground. When they arrived, I barely had time to speak before my mother launched into a tirade. How dare you keep us from our grandchildren? She was livid, her voice rising above the quiet hum of the restaurant. I held my ground. Because I am their mother. It's my job to protect them from anyone I deem toxic. I leaned back, arms crossed. And if that upsets you, go cry to the walls. My father tried to salvage the conversation, his voice laced with forced calm. Your mother didn't mean it. We just want to see our grandson. I scoffed. There it was again. My son. Always my son. I met his gaze, steel in my voice. And my daughter? Why do you never mention her? Silence. Then, the excuses came. How they were still learning, how I should be more forgiving. They even had the audacity to suggest that if I really wanted them to meet my daughter, well, they wouldn't mind it. I saw red. Their casual dismissal of my daughter, their arrogance, their entitlement, it was unbearable. The conversation turned heated, voices rising, accusations flying. But I refused to back down. I laid it out plainly, their outdated favoritism had no place in my family. Their presence was a threat to my children's happiness, and I would not allow it. Then my mother played her last card. We could take this to court. I laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. Go ahead, I said. I would love the chance to tell a judge every horrifying detail of my childhood. Every time you belittled me. Every time you made me feel unwanted. And when I'm done, I'll make sure the whole family knows exactly what you did. Their faces drained of color. They knew I wasn't bluffing. The fight dragged on for minutes, but I had made up my mind. This was the end. They could scream, threaten, beg, nothing would change my decision. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a slow scrape against the floor. You are not welcome in our lives. Ever. Then, I turned and walked away. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Update 3. Months have passed since that final confrontation. Since I shut the door on my parents for good. At first, I worried they might follow through with their court threats. But after reading all your comments, Gerald and I decided to consult a family lawyer. And as it turns out, my parents don't have a leg to stand on. Thousands of messages, proof of their abuse. Every cruel word, every manipulation, preserved in digital form. If they dared to challenge me legally, they would lose. That knowledge brought relief, but the true joy? It came from within my home. Our twins are thriving. They fill our days with laughter, their tiny hands reaching for us, their giggles echoing through the house. Gerald and I are still figuring things out. Parenting is chaos, exhausting and overwhelming, but it's also beautiful. Whenever we can, we visit my grandparents, or we video call them so they can see the babies grow. Gerald's parents have been an incredible support system, stepping in when we need a moment to breathe. They babysit when exhaustion gets the better of me, always there with a helping hand and kind words. Our little family is strong. And we are determined, unyielding, in our mission to shield our children from the kind of pain I endured. Some wounds never truly heal. Some scars remain. But I know this, my children will never bear the same ones I do. They will grow up knowing they are wanted. They are cherished. They are enough. And that makes every battle worth it.